Hello, this is Digital Accessibility, the people behind the progress. I'm Joe Walensky, the creator and host of this series. And as an accessibility professional myself, I find it very interesting as to how others have found their way into this profession. So let's meet one of those people right now and hear about their journey. All right, well, welcome back. And we're here to talk a little bit more about people who have been involved in accessibility. And today I'm happy to be speaking with Bryce Johnson. Hi, Bryce. How are you today?
I'm good, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you here. And we've met before through some of the activities at Microsoft. You've helped out our local accessibility meetup group to visit your place. But where are you talking to us from today?
I'm in Sammamish. I still am at Microsoft headquarters, so I'm just outside of that in Sammamish.
All right, yeah. For people who may not be familiar with the area, Sammamish is an area a little bit further away from Seattle than the Microsoft Redmond campus, kind of getting up toward the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. And I'm in my home office on Vashon Island, although I do get to our Seattle office. So why don't you just start, just let us know a little bit about what you're doing right now with your work at Microsoft.
So right now, I've been focused on hardware accessibility for a number of years now, probably 3 years. And we're all kind of, working on various projects that we're looking at. I think the pandemic showed us that there were a lot of opportunities for us to explore to get people with disabilities employed. And so I think that is our primary focus, is making sure that we're looking at, from a hardware perspective, the barriers that people with disabilities have towards hardware. And, as we kind of come out of the pandemic, we don't want to lose anything that we kind of learned while we were in there. We want to make sure that we're coming into a place like what we would call hybrid work, where people with disabilities can participate equally, whether they're in person or they're, remote, with, the hardware that they need to get the job done.
Well, there's always so much going on with accessibility inside of Microsoft, a lot more than probably people can even notice from the outside of consumers, and we'll get to that. But one of the things that I like to do in this series of interviews is just find out how people got their start, made their way into accessibility. So, why don't you pick a point that you want to start with your career, and then we can kind of follow that back to where you are today.
Yeah, I can go through basically from the beginning pretty quickly. I went to school for photography, and I learned to build web pages to show photos. And this was in the late 90s, and I could build web pages. So I had a job as soon as I left school. I know that's hard for a lot of people to kind of hear, but that's what happened. And as I was building web pages for the design agency that I worked for, I learned about WCAG 1. It just seemed to make sense why wouldn't we create websites that everyone could consume? It just always made sense. Never really was anything beyond that. So I always thought about accessibility back then from a compliance perspective. Fast forward a few years, I was working at a different company. We had a job with Microsoft Canada where we were designing the first digital library for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. So for the first time, my customers were blind, right? Blind, low vision, partially sighted. And, we were creating websites that weren't, accommodating them. They were for them, right? If anything, they were harder to use if you had typical vision. Back then, this was like around 2003. And so that really showed me that kind of point of view that, we can design intentionally for people with disabilities. As around 2008, I moved to Microsoft in Seattle from Toronto, Canada. Always still cared about accessibility, tried to bring it up whenever we could. I was a designer at Microsoft, and in around 2012, I was working in Xbox, and the CVAA was coming up. The CVAA is the 21st Century Telecommunication and Video Accessibility Act. It had been signed into law in 2010. It was on our radar as we were developing what would become Xbox One. So we were looking into how we could apply accessibility and assistive technologies to consoles. So just in late, I think, or in early 2013, the video game lobbying board, lobbied for the industry and got an extension to comply with CVAA for video game consoles from 2013, when the law was supposed to take into effect. That was the year that all the consoles, that Sony and Microsoft launched their new consoles. So they asked for an extension. They got an extension. That was the first time I've ever had features cut based on lobbying. Hopefully it'll be the last. And so we had 2 extra years. So we kind of went about our business. And then we got the band back together in 2014. We started working on how we would apply assistive technologies like narrator and magnifier, these Windows assistive technologies, to console gaming. And at the same time, we were, as we were doing all of this, we had a Microsoft hackathon during our 1-week hackathon. We had to look at what it was, what barriers existed that were unique to gaming. And the one that jumped out, quite honestly, was the controller. If you think about game controllers are these bespoke devices that have been optimized over many generations to assume that you can do this. And if you can't do this, you can't really use a game controller in its optimum way. So we started the design back in 2015 at the hackathon of what would become the Xbox Adaptive Controller. We worked with a charity at the time called Warfighter Engaged. They were a wonderful charity. It was great to, looking back, it was great to start that work with veterans, because, we were designing a controller for limited mobility, but we were doing it for a group of people who were marginalized from society, not only after they return back from service and they have to reintegrate back into society, but if you were injured while you were in service, you were coming back and you couldn't even play video games, which was, if you're in service today, you grew up playing video games. So, they were further isolated socially by not even being able to play video games. And that story was very clear, that we were creating the adaptive controller for folks with limited mobility, but we were doing it to support the health of our vets. And that was the start of the journey. We worked with a lot of other charities, both, veteran and other charities. We worked with Able Gamers, Special Effect, Warfighter Engaged, Craig Hospital, and the Cerebral Palsy Foundation to basically build this controller. It's kind of unheard of in the hardware industry to bring in, hardware is really secretive. So we brought in 5 charities in the middle of the development process, but we believed in nothing about us without us. So they were our stakeholders from the beginning. They were our partners. And that's when we designed the Xbox Adaptive Controller.
Well, I do want to come back to the controller to talk about that a little bit more, but just going back to where you transitioned from, doing some of that first review of WCAG as, with the design agency, and then moving to Microsoft and getting into what you're doing now. I mean, I'm assuming there's a lot went on there. It's kind of a big leap. So maybe, one of the things maybe ask you about is, how was it trying to learn the things that you needed to do, or like, what did you have to lean on or do to be able to feel like you were moving forward in understanding the space for people with physical challenges and how to support that?
Sure. And I mean, I haven't, while my background is in WCAG, I think everyone who works in technology can get traced back to WCAG. I don't really care what you work in. Like there's always those lineages. I've really haven't focused on that type of I'll call it remediation for a really long time. I think for us, about 5 years ago at Microsoft, we started to think about what our inclusive design practice was. And at the time, my boss and my mentor, August de los Reyes, he always talked about the difference between accessibility and inclusive design in a way that really appealed to me. He talked about accessibility being like, you have a barrier and what's the facilitator to get over the barrier, right? Like an engineering approach. It's like, well, you have a problem. What's the solution to the problem? Whereas we always talked about inclusive design as, hey, what if we just didn't design the barriers in the first place? Right? And how do we think about it? He always compared inclusive design to urban planning. In a way, which is, just to think a little bit more holistically and to synthesize those solutions across different groups of, functional limitation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's what's, I think, changed for us is like you have this foundation of tried and true accessibility practices that you build off of, but it's not everything,
Well, then, as you found your way into the gaming space, I imagine that that would be an area where people who had been in gaming design for a long time would just the idea of what it would take to make games more accessible would seem to even look like a more difficult climb or solving an engineering problem than maybe other things like a website or some other type of application. Was there any kind of, that things going on along those lines where everybody really had to reset what it meant to be inclusive in a way that hadn't been possible before?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you look at like game developers. If you look at general purpose computing, there's always been a strong tie to academia. So that means there's always been a strong tie to accessibility, because academia has always had a lot of interest in accessibility. And so therefore, if you're working with like any kind of human computer interaction team, it comes up. Whereas like video games, maybe a decade ago, I can definitely say this because I was there. Video games were like video game players designing video games for people like themselves, right? They didn't really do a lot of outward work. I remember like when user research was new to the video game field, right? Like they literally were designing games for each other, right? And so when we started to come in and we started to talk about accessibility in games, it was hard because I think one of the biggest things that is difficult in accessibility is, that getting over your own biases that you've naturally built through like a lifetime of interactions. It's really easy for people to say, get over your biases, but those things are what shape you, right? And so, in our practice, in our inclusive design practice, we say, it's hard to get over your biases. We acknowledge that it's difficult, and that a large part of the work is getting over your biases. And you get over your biases by working with people with disabilities, right? You can't. I don't believe you can read enough books to understand what people with disabilities need. You really have to work with the community. So yeah, I will say that for video games, that was tough. I will also say though that, I've been around, I've been in accessibility adjacent for 20 years and gaming has caught up faster than anybody. Like they might have started last, but man, are they going quick. And they're doing some really wild stuff. Because if you think about a game engine, as it exists today, there's no object model in a game engine. It paints pixels on a screen, right? So how do you start to make these experiences that are, not only that are more complex than most interactions, yeah, and you don't even have an object model, and let alone, like, I think one of the things, that we've always talked about when it comes to gaming, you're not trying to remove all the barriers in a game. You're trying to right size the barriers in a game, right? It's not like building like an intake form or something like that, where you want to eliminate barriers. Like, gaming is barrier, right? Like assonance, dissonance, push pull, like that challenge is why people play. So it isn't about eliminating the challenge, it's about making the challenge fit a diverse group of individuals.
Well, I moved away from you. Kind of ended your story where you got to the Xbox controller, and I mean, I'm gonna want to mention that anybody interested in that, that they could probably easily just type that into a search engine, and you're gonna find a lot of information, because I'll pat you on the back for that, or your team, because it rightfully got a lot of good media coverage, I think, and it's a really good story to hear. And so I think people can kind of look in and see what that's all about. But one of the things that kind of went beyond that for me is when you invited us to be able to use your space at the Xbox Lab, where there was a lot more than the hand controller, because you demonstrated different assistive devices to be able to do input output with the controller. So you really have expanded how you think about how people interact with your devices.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the adaptive controller taught us, and I appreciate your encouragement there. We've been overwhelmed by the positivity of it. I will say that it was the first device of its kind from us, and we learned a lot, and there's still a lot to do that we could improve. So yes, you can type it into like, you can Google Xbox adaptive controller, and you get all kinds of people talking about it. But I think we still need to do better on showing people how to use it, and that part, I will say, is tricky, because we've always been slightly medical adjacent. We work a lot with occupational therapists and other types of therapy. So, but in the end of the day, we're a game controller, we're a toy. We want to just have people have fun. So yeah, you came by the lab, and that's super cool. We have this space at Microsoft called the Inclusive Tech Lab. We look forward to hosting people again this fall. And what we do in that space is it's really a space for people with disabilities. We like to think of it as an embassy on campus for the disability communities that we serve, because we try to make the space as accessible as possible. And we're always learning and trying to do better there. But what we do is, when people come in, we have the things that they either need to get up and running, whether it's with a game or with some other type of like input output interaction. But what we've been learning is basically that for especially for people with limited mobility, modularity and multimodal interaction is really the way to go. And so when I say multimodal, it's like, how do we start to combine different input modalities and orchestrate them in a way that makes sense for the person, and then the system just figures it out. So there's lots of interaction designs out there that are like voice only or touch only, or but how do we actually start to do better with multiple ones at the same time? Like, what is voice and touch at the same time? What is switch and I don't know. I would say switch and mouse or switch and eye gaze is a good one to actually think about. How do we think about, because I'll work with people like, say, quadriplegics who will use switch interfaces on their mobile phones, but every once in a while they'll pull out a stylus, and they'll put it in their mouth, and they'll point and click like the rest of us, because it really just depends on your mood and how you feel and what you're trying to do. I think this idea that there are certain ways that people with disabilities interact with computers is false. So
yeah. Like while we were there, this goes back a couple years ago when we were there at the lab, but there was also a demo that was running about purely audible cues for interactions. That was another one that I was really amazed to encounter that.
Yeah, it's cool because if you think about audio, right, like we always, accessibility, we always think about screen readers and we think about that. But what gaming sort of showed us was that people who are blind can take in multiple sources of audio in ways that I think typical folks can't, or maybe not can't. That's not the right word, but don't. Maybe is a better word of thinking about it. So how many years are we're designing these screen reader experiences where you have this single channel of of a mono voice basically telling you what this immensely complex visual interface is, and how else could we start to represent that data sonically? I have this thing going right now where I'm questioning the usefulness of audio description for specific types of video, because right now I feel like you get a lot of add audio description. You're like, but what is the content? And no one's asking those questions, right? It's just like, no, you have to have audio description, and I think, and I mean, I'm not saying no, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have audio description, but I do wonder what's better. I do wonder if there is something better, right? I mean, I remember, so there's this musician in Seattle. Her name's Lexi Khan, and she's blind. And she came in and she was talking to us about, a bunch of stuff. And she was talking about audio description. And she's like, they never tell me if the guy who's talking is hot or not. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. They don't. So she's always got to ask people in the room, like, is he hot? And I'm like, and that's really it's really kind of what I wonder about a lot of these things, like we have all these best practices, but at the end of the day, are we actually conveying it in as best as we can? So
yeah, we're always iterating, just keep moving forward wherever we can. Another area that I wanted to ask about, a lot of us we're in different size organizations, structured differently. Certainly Microsoft is mammothly sized organization with many divisions, departments, products, services. It's so big. You have your part. You've talked to us a little bit about what you're involved in, but how does it feel from your perspective of how it is with the work that you do, and then how does that work into Microsoft's broader commitments to accessibility? Is there a corporate wide support network that kind of brings forward kind of top level ideas and supports, or is it more controlled in your individual area where you're responsible for your own progress forward?
Well, I mean, we have an ambition as a company, and that's embedded in our mission, empower every person. We take that literally. And the direction of our accessibility practice is centralized under our Chief Accessibility Officer, Jenny Leigh Fleury. So, I mean, how we deal with it kind of goes from division to division. We're all kind of a little bit different. I think there are some parts of the company that are very driven by what we would call our trusted tester, practice, which is a rigorous, accessibility testing protocol that we put all of our software products through. Hardware is a little bit different as far as trusted tester goes, but all the software products go through that, and so that's part of the foundation again. I think it really just depends on where your challenges are. I think about mobility a lot because I work in hardware. I think a lot of software folks, tend to think a lot more about vision, which is completely understandable. And it's not like we don't think about vision. There are things that we've done with the Surface keyboard specifically for our blind users. We added tactile bumps to F4 and F8 on our Surface keyboard to give our blind users a little bit more of affordances on where their fingers are on the keyboard. We made FN lock available to the screen to Windows Narrator on Windows, the state of FN lock. So everyone's familiar with caps lock, right? You have a screen reader on, you hit caps lock, it says caps lock on, caps lock off. But up until a few years ago, FN lock or FN, the screen reader didn't know the state of those keys, and not just with our keyboards, with all keyboards. Because when we looked at it, we started to add that to the HID specification for keyboards. So we had to basically go to the standards body of keyboards and say, listen, we want to add FN and FN lock as keys that are known to the operating system. And until we did that with the launch of Laptop 3, that wasn't a thing. And so, we're moving forward a little bit at a time.
There, any new exciting things that you're able to talk about?
I'm excited. I'm excited for, I think, what's kind of coming. There was a blog post of what's coming for accessibility in Windows 11. So that's going to be exciting. We will, we'll have more to share next time we talk about our devices. But I think we are starting to we're starting to get to a place where we see things that we can kind of go after. Because I will say, like, when I first showed up in hardware, if you just look from a compliance perspective, I'm going to tell you it's impossible for some things to fail. Like, if you look at the compliance rules as I've read them for, like, say, Section 508 for hardware, or EN 301, it's pretty hard for a mouse to fail those rules, the way they're written. But that doesn't mean that we don't have tons of opportunity to make more accessible mice. So,
well, Bryce, thanks a lot for taking this time to share a little bit about your background and the things that you're working on and are looking forward to in the future, and hopefully be able to get back to the lab when we're able to come back out of this, get back together in the physical world again.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Joe.